So welcome to this session on raising investment for sport and leisure. We've been running a number of these theme sessions and we've got a few more to come. Really looking at kind of that broader financial mix for organisations. Obviously we're in challenging times, particularly at the moment, in terms of looking at income generation, in terms of looking at the funding landscape. And so we're really trying to give people that much broader perspective. So we're delighted as well to also be able to look at kind of the community shares option and the crowdfunding kind of space as well today a little bit. So I'm delighted to be presenting this from Social Investment Scotland. Just a quick introduction to SIS, I guess is the acronym you may have come across. We ourselves are a charity and social enterprise, and since 2001 we've invested over £80 million in 400 plus organisations across Scotland. We very much see ourselves as part of the much broader social enterprise ecosystem here in Scotland, which the little map on the right is meant to give you a bit of a sense of. There's lots of business support out there that's always available, and if you wanted to know more about that, feel free again to ask questions. So we've got a great session lined up today. So James Steele from Sports Scotland is going to start us off in a minute, just setting the scene really about kind of looking at the sports sector and the role of Sports Scotland. And then he's going to lead in, I think, nicely, and then I'll introduce Craig Graham, who's chairman at Spartans Community Football Academy, who's going to take us through their investment journey. They've had a long relationship with Social Investment Scotland now, and he'll talk a little bit about that. But really, the lessons are there, I think, regardless of who you might be approaching in terms of investment. So I hope you'll really get something out of that. And then once we've heard from our guest speakers, and we'll have the chance to do some Q&A with them, I'm going to take you through the kind of broader picture around introducing social investment, what it is, and how you can use it as part of a wider finance mix, the kind of things you might want to think about if you were looking at that finance mix within your organisation, both as staff or as trustees and directors. And then we're going to look a bit more in the practicalities, as if you were going down that route, what you might look for in terms of getting ready for investment, how you might select an investment partner, and how you might apply. And then finally, we'll be handing over to Toby, who's going to take us through the community shares model. So we've got a full session. If you do want to ask any questions to James or Graham James or Craig in this first session, then please just put them through the chat or the Q&A, and I'll be posting them to James or Craig as we come to that. So feel free to do that. It'd be great to have you interacting, posting comments. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to James now. So I will stop my share and let him put up his slides just for a moment. So James, lead manager at Sports Scotland, over to you.
Thank you, Naomi, and good afternoon, everybody. Really appreciate the invite to be part of the conversation today. Just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see my slides coming through just now. Okay, so my role today really is just to take 10 minutes to give you a bit of the national perspective. And before you hear from Craig, as Naomi said, about how Spartans are using social investment to support the people of North Edinburgh. Sport for Life is a national strategy for sport. It sets out the direction for Sport Scotland, but most importantly for sport itself, and celebrates how everybody in Scotland can benefit from sport. We've been really focused on building a system for sport over the long term, and our thinking around that system has certainly evolved over the past 10 years. I've been with Sport Scotland for 14 years now, and I've definitely seen a real shift from, probably fairly traditional sport for sport's sake models to more of a recognition of the contribution that sports make to wider society and the wider outcomes that sport can achieve. So the there's clear body of evidence, growing body of evidence and research on the benefits that sport can deliver in terms of social outcomes, whether it's fun, health, skill development, achieving success and medals. Whatever the reason for getting into sport, it's about people enjoying as many of those benefits as possible at any stage of their life. What I would encourage you to do at this point is maybe just either take a screen grab or a picture of this slide that's on screen just now. I think when you start to hear Craig tell the Spartans story, you'll identify with how Spartans are able to ensure that everybody in their community is benefiting from sport in a number of different ways. So I would encourage you to do that just now. The mission we've set out really is to help the people of Scotland get the most out of the sporting system, and the language is important there. I think we have a really strong sporting system in Scotland. The challenge now is just using that strength within the system to make sure that the people of Scotland get the most out of it. Today's session, as Naomi's mentioned, is about raising investment. The schematic on the screen there shows you a really simple representation of the sporting system. And if I was to walk you through that system in the context of today's conversation, it would look a little bit like this. It's about making investments, in this case, social investments, in club and community organisations. And within those organisations, in the people, their places, and/or the profile of those organisations to deliver outcomes. And those outcomes could be active Scotland outcomes, detailed at the top, or, as I've said, as this system's evolved, and more importantly for the context of today, wider outcomes, and those social outcomes that sport has the ability to deliver on. The sporting system needs strong club and community organisations at its heart. To support those organisations, we've published what we call a club and community framework. It's available on our website. And in essence, it's a support resource to help those organisations to reflect and improve. It's made up of the 6 areas on the screen. Each of these areas essentially has equal importance for those organisations being successful, but for the purposes of today's session, the focus is particularly on the sustainable area, which is where the actions that relate to investments sit. So we will hear in a minute from Craig, who will talk about Spartans, and he'll talk about the successful financial model that Spartans have built and the impact that is delivering. Now, this image here is just a grab straight from the Club and Community Framework itself. The document defines sustainability as organisations operating in a way that ensures they'll be around for the long term. Obviously, that aligns to the long-term development of the sporting system. And I'm not going to go through all the areas, but I will pull out a couple of specific examples from this list of action statements. The first runs around, organisations need to understand what their version of sustainability looks like. And the point I would make here is that we understand every organisation is unique. I know a number of the organisations that are on the call, and you'll be listening to Craig today. You'll be hearing about some of the opportunities and the decisions that Spartans have made, and some of those will be relevant to you, some of those won't be relevant to you. It's about you soaking in that information and taking what you need and using that to apply to your unique scenario that you're faced with. The second point I would pick out is about organisations being ready for investment and having a forward plan. The example that I would use here is just one from a professional role at Sports Scotland. And if I go back to probably 10 years plus ago, we felt that the sporting system required more resource and support for club and community organisations. We had ideas at Sports Scotland about how we could do that, but within the budgets that we were receiving at that time from Exchequer and from the National Lottery, we weren't able to action any of those aspirations. The government asked us to make a contribution to the legacy of Glasgow 2014, and we took that investment as an opportunity to take some of those plans off the shelf and turn them into fruition. So that's where we were able to establish the Community Sport Hub initiative. The thinking was already done on it. We were able to draw down the investment, and now we've got an initiative there that's been running, developing for 10 years, and is a key part of the sporting system that I've been talking about. The third action that I would draw your attention to is arguably the most important one. And again, if I'm being fairly honest, as a trustee of a local sporting charity myself, is the area that I think sport's probably most deficient in, is understanding the difference that we expect to make for those people that are taking part. And we need to be aware of and we need to measure the impact that we're having on people, and it's definitely an area that the sporting system can improve on. I know Spartans do an amazing job of this, both within the quantitative detail they have on the work that they do, but also on the stories that they tell about people. So I would encourage you to kind of see this monitoring piece within your organisations as an opportunity rather than an obligation. And I think if you can view it that way, then I think you're in a really, really strong place. My final thoughts then, I suppose, just to wrap things up before we hand over to Craig. You're going to get lots of information in this next session. If we only had 10 seconds in a lift going from the ground floor to the first floor, then I would probably leave you with the 2 points at the bottom of this slide, which is I'd encourage you to understand what's needed in your community. And by that, I don't mean sport. I mean, what's going on in your community, what are the issues, understand those. And the second thing I would encourage you to do is to be comfortable seeking out partnerships. I think if you can do those two things, if nothing else, then you start to take a good step towards becoming investment ready. So I'm going to hand over to back to Naomi at this point, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Craig tell us the story of the investment Spartans have received and how they've turned that into an impact in the north of Edinburgh.
Thank you, James. We wanted to do that kind of general introduction because I think already there's lots of issues that come out around social impact measurement that I've kind of started to think of making notes, and we might touch on that when we come to the Q&A a little bit, and just trying to understand that much broader landscape. So I wanted to pass on without further ado to Craig. He'll have so many lessons and tips, I think, that will come for us from Spartan's journey, and I know he's looking forward, I think, Craig, to talking us through his couple of slides. So I'm going to turn my video off and get ready to share the slides that he's prepared and hand over to Craig. So over to you.
Many thanks, Naomi. Like James, delighted to be here today, and thanks for giving us the opportunity to share bits of our story with you. I think my background is probably similar to many of you on the call. When I joined Spartans as a player in 1984, so and I know many of you have also been involved in your organisations for a long time as well. It certainly comes a labour of love. I did a little bit of introduction before we go on to the slides about Spartans. I was part of a small team that set up the Spartans Community Football Academy, which in essence is the charitable arm of the football club. We set that up about 12 years ago, 2006, 2007, yeah. And Spartans Community Football Academy, for those of you who don't know, and we're a social enterprise. We've got two elements of our business. In essence, our trading arm, which is all about high quality sports stadium that we rent out. We've a cafe bar, we run community coaching. So in essence, a revenue generating line to our business. And then we've got we deliver a series of programs designed to make a real difference in North Edinburgh, whether they be education, whether it be youth work, whether they be all about health and well-being. In the last few months, we've turned our set up to a major food hub operation, which some of you might have seen about either on our social media or in the press. So today is about that social enterprise. We turn over about just over £1 million. We've got about 26 employees and literally an army, a Spartan army of volunteers. So that's the Spartans Community Football Academy. And Naomi, if you wouldn't mind putting up my first slide. Maybe, yeah. Thank you, Naomi. What I thought I'd just is talk you through the investment that we've raised, because it just allows me to then talk in context about what we had to do to get it. So we've really had 3 slugs of investment, as you were. It totals about 6 million. About 80% of it is either through grants or donations, and about 20% of it is through loans and national social investment loans. So that's what we've done, and it's come in really 3 tranches. The first tranche was when we first started, way back in 2007, 2008. I'll come back on to this later, but the seed capital, to use an investment term, was from the club, the football club doing well in the Scottish Cup. And also, we had a number of members that we invited to put a little bit of cash in. But what it did do is show the commitment that the Spartans community had to this programme. And between the two, there was probably only 200,000 of the 4 million, but it showed a real commitment. Our second slug of that initial amount was £1 million that the council gave us, in essence, as a contribution to the project, but in essence also to buy out the lease we had on an existing football ground. And as part of that property deal, Miller Homes put in a little bit of money as well. But then we had to raise the balance, which was a significant sum. It was about 2.5–3 million of that 4. And that was where we went on this journey, which Dougie, who's on the call today, will remember vividly, around, and I've only mentioned there 6 or 7 of those who contributed, but I think we had about 25 different funders. But the social investment bit came from Social Investment Scotland and from Big Issue Invest, and that was very much a starter for us. I think we've got $500,000 between the two, and these agreements, we've actually just paid off Big Issue Invest, but the Social Investment Scotland one, we've paid some of it off, and we've rolled some of it forward. That was the first tranche. We then, in 2011-12, extended our building, and we also changed a grass football pitch to a synthetic one. And that was just over £1 million. And for this, in essence, we went back to our initial funders. We had built a track record by that point. They were confident in what we could deliver. It was helped that there was something called a Social Investment Fund that Social Investment Scotland administered. So there was a relatively new fund that was available for a short time we could get access to. And then finally, a programme that we're literally just finishing just now, where we're replacing the synthetic pitches they just had to be upgraded. They had, the life had expired. We built a youth workspace, and we also changed all our floodlights to LED, which actually did cost not far off 200,000. So that was another investment programme. For there, we've actually got some new funders in both Resilient Scotland and Resource Efficient Scotland. Those of you who know them know that they provide a mixture of grant and loan funding. So we've got, our loans are back up, but both good organisations to work with. And then we've got some grants from people like the Scottish Football Partnership, the Landfill Trusts again, and the likes of Walter Scott, who helped with the youth workspace. So just by way of what the investment was over what time frame, because it then helps me tell the story about why do we think we were successful. So Naomi, if you wouldn't mind popping up the second line. Fantastic. Okay, well, it's no one thing. I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that. It's a combination of things that we felt we had to get right for people to believe in us and for us to raise the investment. So the first thing, I mentioned it earlier, is about we had a skin in the game. We could demonstrate to people that we ourselves had raised some money. It was the seed capital. We were willing to invest that partly speculatively, to be honest, but also to do some research. Dougie wore out some shoe leather wandering around North Edinburgh, really understanding what the community needed. And he also went abroad to Scandinavia and to Germany to understand, well, how did community sports club really make a difference? What did they do that we perhaps hadn't yet thought of in Scotland? So that was the first thing. We thought that was, and people still talk about, we had that initial investment ourselves into the project. The second one, and certainly one of the most important ones, we had a very clear and we had an ambitious vision that was based on that research, as I say, that Dougie and the guys did. But we really focused on what we want to build. It was about making a difference in North Edinburgh. It was about using sport as the hook, which was, you know, relatively early in the thinking. It's much more prevalent now. And having that clarity so that we could explain to funders what we wanted to achieve. The next element is about the team. We're fortunate we were able to put together a team from all different disciplines, whether it was a legal discipline, a finance discipline, an education background. You'll see in our board of trustees, we've got marketing skills, we've got a whole range. We've got a couple of politicians, always helpful. So we've got a whole range. So it was about putting together, in the same way that for any sport, you put a team on the pitch with lots of different skills. It was about us putting a team behind us that could really help drive our project forward. But the other thing, and all of us, Debbie, Dougie, myself, and the board often talk about, we always aim for investing in the top quality that we can possibly afford. I think there's an economic reason to do that because it gives longevity and things generally last and look good for a while. But the other thing, it sets expectations, it sets that we are going to be as good as we possibly can be. So it's everything from whether it's, you know, the goal nets and the goal posts you're buying, or the smart board in the cafe bar, or whatever it is. We do try to stretch for excellence in terms of the team we recruit as well. Who's the best people we can possibly get. But at the end of the day, investors are looking for a return on their money, and you have to have a robust business case. We were very clear in this model we had about generating revenue, and we use the term a lot. It's a Robin Hood model, where we're taking money from those who can afford it and using that money to then reinvest in those who are less fortunate or less able to afford it. So we have a robust business case based over, you know, a 3, 5, 10-year horizon for some of our investments. We did a research into what our cost would be to running venues like the one we've got. And that was a critical tool to demonstrate that we could not just pay back the loan, but also pay back the interest rates that these guys have to charge. Okay. As I said earlier on, we've had another couple of goes after that initial funding. And really picking up on what James was saying is you have to have a quantifiable track record. Part of the story, yes, is the videos that many of you do and we do as well, which tell the emotional story. Whether it's from those we've helped, whether it's from the teachers that work with some of our youth workers. That's a great story to tell, but at the same point, we've got to be able to demonstrate that we are delivering a return. And we do use the social investment return model. We've used it in 3 particular times, most recently in a project with the SFA and with UEFA, the football body. Yeah. But also it's been able to demonstrate to funders the number of people who have been through our programs, the number of people who have ended up in positive destinations. Is very important for the alternative school that we run to demonstrate to funders that we are making a difference to the lives of individuals. I remember very early on when we first opened it, it was a start that stayed around, and we used it a lot in the first year. That knife crime fell by 40% in the first 6 months we were open. And that was a quantifiable number that the police gave us that we're able to use for that small period to make people wake up, take an interest, and we just built on that track record over time. A couple of other things I think as well, and I think Scotland generally as a country and sport to a certain extent as well can be accused of of not changing quickly enough and resting on laurels and then they'd be resistant to change. So we've worked hard to try and keep a learning culture. So, you know, whether it's trips to other organizations overseas in Europe. Yesterday, I was actually in a call to a group in New Orleans that are doing some academic research into the impact of sport, and Dougie's been quite heavily involved in the guys out there in New Orleans. So we always feel that learning more is good. And we don't just learn from us going to talk to other people. There's loads of people come and see us, and they always are keen to find out what we did. But every single visit, we pick something else. We pick something from. There was a couple of guys from a sailing project in Campbelltown on the west coast that came to see Dougie on Friday before last. And they were very grateful when they left. But we did say, look, you know, having spent 2 hours with you guys, we've learned some great points as well. So it's both ways. It's about learning what others do and picking the good things and making sure that you do change what you do. And finally, risk-taking. I think we're very fortunate. We've got a board of trustees who, certainly for the most part, are up for taking some chances. Now, not everything we try pays off. We've done investments into other sporting facilities. We looked at rugby and gymnastics, for example, in a project that we spent quite a lot of money on that hasn't come off. So we do take some risks. We're not reckless, but I think you've got to take some risks to get there. And as long as you're taking them in a managed process, I think it shows as well to funders an investment model that you've got a mindset and a culture that's going to try and achieve and deliver. And the final point, I think the polite way of saying it is with people at the right time, in the right place. Might also say it was a bit of luck. I think, to be honest, we met Penny Lockhead from P&R Leisure right at the very start. She was one of a number of fundraisers we could use. Penny got our project really quickly and was excellent. We were very fortunate. She had a great relationship with the then leader of City of Edinburgh Council. He's certainly the easiest leader we've ever had to deal with, but it meant we got the project over the line, or the early bits of the project over the line far quicker than we would have done. There was a site available for us. Again, you know, it was about being in the right time, the right place with a bit of luck. And also, you know, we've been lucky, we've got some high profile people behind what we do. We started with Gordon Strachan, who's always been a patron. He was a high profile football manager at Celtic and then at Scotland when we were needing his help, which was great. But then since then, people like Ian Rankin and Tom Kitchen, these guys, they're not just names, they are involved in our project, but they also give it credibility, which does make such a difference, again, when you're trying to raise investment, to invest in new things. I've just put at the end, there's an awful lot of material on our website, so it will tell you more, but what I've just tried to do in the last 15 minutes is run through our story in terms of, you know, raising that £6 million that we've invested, and certainly what we felt we had to get right to enable us to be successful. Thank you. Naomi.
Thank you, Craig. I noticed you didn't mention Gordon Strachan and his history at Wolverhampton Wanderers, but we won't need to talk about that. No. Thank you. I'll just stop the screen share a minute. I've got a few questions that have come through. So I'm just going to start. I mean, I thought it was already interesting, and I think the reason we wanted to get both James and yourself, Craig, on today is I thought it was interesting that James talked very much about organisations needing to look beyond that sport aspect and almost look wider. I thought it was really interesting hearing you speak, talking particularly, I think, of the food hub that you've recently had to do in terms of completely pivoting to some degree. You know, that is quite a diversion, I guess, from the sport activity, and the youth work, I guess, obviously has a link, but I thought it was interesting that you very much touched on that need to look much broader in terms of community needs. So it's always nice when the presentations kind of gel together. In terms of some of the questions I got, perhaps starting off on that kind of looking at how you go beyond just the kind of sporting aspects. I know, having done some presentations with sporting organisations before, much of what they've often been asked to record were perhaps data and statistics around participation more than anything. And I think there's still a real nervousness or lack of clarity about perhaps some of that much more broader measurement around the social impact. And I wondered if you could perhaps just talk a little bit, Craig, you talked about storytelling, but are there specific things that you would pick up on in terms of tips around that broader social impact measurement for groups?
Well, I mean, maybe it's because I'm an accountant by trade. What I do like talking about is the actual social return on investment model. So and I realise they're not perfect, but they are reasonably good. So our funders have asked us to do it twice. We did it first of all with University of Edinburgh, and then secondly with University of Stirling, where they measure, in pound terms, if you get somebody doing an hour of exercise a week that they previously weren't doing, creating employment, creating education opportunities. They have a model put together, and ours has ranged between £6 and £7 of return, for every pound invested. And then most recently, it was just published earlier this year, actually just before lockdown, was a study that UEFA did. So I think these are more difficult to do. You can't, none of us are skilled to do them on our own, but what I would urge is when you're talking to funders is offer the opportunity to be willing to be part of that journey with an education establishment that can help you. And certainly it's really powerful for us if we go out and say, look, if you give us £1, we will deliver not just that £1 back, but an extra 6 or an extra 7 or an extra 8. So, and that's maybe my accounting angle coming, but certainly, obviously, every grant or loan funding body has got lots of accountants on them, so they like the numbers as well.
No, thank you. I mean, I know some groups do particularly like the social return on investment, and for some perhaps smaller organisations, they find it quite a complex tool. And I guess I'd always say there is actually lots of sessions and advice you can go out there in terms of looking at that social impact measurement. And I think one of the tips I often got told around it was always be prepared, almost be childlike in terms of asking why, what difference did something make and why is that? Because actually, participation in sport can actually be the thing that it could be helping in terms of isolation, alcohol addiction. There's a much broader thing, and it's always digging into the kind of further whys that can be really helpful. I didn't know, James, if you got anything you wanted to add to that conversation.
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, I talked about the system and the system evolving over years, and I think this is an area where sport can learn a heck of a lot over the next few years. And I know we've certainly had a look at the social return on investment information that's there, and some people are like that. Some people question it a bit, but I think Craig's point of be open to learning, be open to what other experts can teach you, and if we do that, then we'll improve the system. I've got no doubt that this conversation in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years time, I think this will be a feature of more of a feature of what more clubs do, and we won't be leaning on Spartans as the learning example at the moment. There'll be other organisations, hopefully organisations on this call, that have learned from the partnerships they've been in and the experts in some of these fields to really add depth to what they do in communities, which is phenomenal. I mean, the bit that sticks in my mind with Spartans, to go back to the start of your question, you walk in and there's a huge sign that says "Here for Good." Now, I know instantly what they're about, and it's not about football. It's about that community. So I'm not surprised that they're becoming a hub for food distribution, because they are there in that community for good, not for football.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? Just in terms of how you position yourself. And as you were talking, I guess, about getting that advice, I was interested. Craig was talking about how, talking about the folk from Campbelltown, there's always something to learn off other people. And you were talking a bit about kind of almost there being that sense of luck about who you had connections with at the start. And I guess I always encourage people, make connections. Even if you don't have a particular reason for that connection now, you don't know when that connection is going to be useful. So these opportunities to really engage with other people, perhaps while a bit more challenging at the moment, are really useful in terms of future development. There's a few questions coming in, and I'm going to come to those, but I just got a couple more general ones first. I guess in terms of looking at the funding landscape, I mean, I look at it from a kind of broader social enterprise perspective on some level, but a lot of money has obviously gone into dealing with current COVID situations, and funding's becoming, I think, quite a difficult situation for lots of organisations moving forward. So there's that sense of, you know, making sure that organisations, perhaps if they've traditionally had a long period of funding, don't get a sense of, I guess, entitlement. And how do we really try to encourage groups to look more broadly so that actually they're not jumping from just one funding piece to the next? And is there something about the funding landscape, James, that would be useful for groups to kind of have an understanding? Do you think funds are diminishing moving forwards, or is competition just increasing?
Yeah, tricky question at the moment, particularly where a lot of organisations, you know, are relying on, I guess, new emergency investment to keep themselves afloat. You know, I think we're the point I would make is we need to keep talking. You know, at Sports Scotland, I'm really keen that we're part of conversations like this, so we've got an understanding of the realities of what's going on the ground. What I do know is that, you know, our primary investment is in local authority partners and governing body partners. And there's a team of professional staff out there that we spend a lot of time talking with, connecting up and developing to support club and community organisations on the ground. So although I can't, you know, don't have the crystal ball and know, you know, whether, you know, investment's going to increase, decrease, stay the same, what I do know is there's a team of people there that through conversation can help us work through the realities that organisations are faced with. And I go back to my point about organisations being unique. They are all unique. They've all taken a unique approach to dealing with the pandemic. They've taken a unique approach to their members. So, you know, for me, we've just got to keep talking with each other. We've got to, you know, as volunteers, you know, using the professional officers that are around there to help you and navigate whatever's to come. So, but I do believe that, you know, you know, as the understanding of the social impact of sport increases, then the opportunities for investment for sport should increase. You know, that I do think will come.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging times, I think, whatever sector you're in at the moment. Craig, were you going to come in on that?
Just to say, I mean, but I think it's better from when we started, because we had the financial, we were launching our project initially 10 years ago when the financial crunch was on, and the reality was our only choice was social investment Scotland, our big issue invest. Whereas now, you know, for that funding, obviously there's Resilient Resource Efficient Scotland for their particular ones. You know, there's some banks like Triodos and Co, I don't know where they are now, but they've certainly in recent years been up for more social investment. So I think, although it might be a bit tighter, I think for loan funding, I think the markets is certainly better than it was when we started 10 years ago. So whether you'll get any movement on the interest rates that these organisations charge is maybe a different issue.
Thanks, Craig. It's always a challenging question, and I think it's a fair one in terms of how we look at risk and how we manage all of that, I guess, in terms of social investment. So we always get asked that, and actually, as we go through some of the slides I've got later, we've got inserts in the slides that people can look at after this presentation that talk about how we calculate our interest rates, because it's a question we often get asked. So there's a few specific questions coming in, I guess, about Spartans that I thought I'd just pick up on, if that's all right, Craig. So how do you think the link between the kind of the professional football club and the charity have really helped you in terms of, I guess, the approach in terms of how you looked at getting investment, how you were perceived? Was it a door opener, or what was the link there?
I think that the two are intrinsically linked. I mean, right at the very start, we're lucky because the football club had come to national press through a couple of cup runs, so we had that. But I think from a business sense, it meant we had an anchor tenant from the charity, who in essence, given the scale and size of Spartans in terms of our women's team and set up on our youth section, we had in essence a captive audience that could underpin the business plan. I think as well the fact that we could demonstrate that, you know, across all the elements of Spartans, we were, you know, 95% of a single view and a single mind, which is often difficult when you're dealing with voluntary predominantly voluntary organisations. So I think it's really helped in a number of ways. You know, in local schools where we're working, some of the children will be part of the Spartans, some of them will have at least heard the Spartans and played on the pitch. Others won't at all. So, but it just maybe gets a few of the children interested in our programs because, you know, it's that very strong link to football. It's less interest to others. So the whole package seems to work together. You need the two, and it strengthens. And, you know, we're now in a position where we're very much a pillar in North Edinburgh.
Yeah, and I guess it leads in potentially, I guess, to one of the other questions that's coming about. What then do you think has been the link? I mean, obviously having your own facility and being able to use that as a kind of a base then for the foundation, did that help, or in terms of having that?
Yeah.
I guess you've got the security of that.
It's the security, but also you're in charge of your own destiny. You're not relying on somebody else to, you know, I don't know, cut the grass or operate the cafe or be there to open the door. So you dictate the hours you open, you know, and very early on, I remember we did a midnight and beyond youth club because that was the time at which we were needed. You know, if we had been, you know, in a council environment, there's no way we would have been allowed to run a youth club at midnight, you know. So I think it gives you so much flexibility. Now it's onerous because you take on an 8-year lease, you take on insurance, you take on a commitment to maintain a building that is MD. You know, else Nicole, who runs sporting facilities, is all sorts of things can go wrong and do go wrong. You know, so again, it's about, you know, we're taking a risk. I think in Edinburgh, outside the Hibs, Hearts and Murrayfield, every other sporting facility almost had been run by, well, take out the universities, I guess, as well, had been run by the local authorities. So we were somebody completely new coming in, and we certainly, you know, got some opposition as a result, because what do you know about running a sporting site? So. But no, I think if clubs have options, even if it means a big stretch, take responsibility for your own site.
No, it's interesting. I mean, I wasn't talking about it in the future link necessarily with the asset and the physical space, but I think that sense of control over your own destiny is certainly one of the things I'll come on to talk about when I say, well, why social investment? It's that kind of sense that actually you're getting someone to invest in your plan rather than fitting what you want to do to what a funder's plan is. And it's always kind of understanding those balance between the two. And I think the reason we always then talk of that kind of broad finance mix is I think you'll know that there's some activities that you do that really do require the grant funding. They simply would never be commercially viable, and you need that broad finance mix to really enable you to meet the kind of social and the commercial aspects of running a community facility. Yeah. So it's very much a blend approach that we talk about. I wanted to just pick up about, you talked about the board a little bit, and I know that certainly my experience of talking to organisations about looking at loan finance, I think we always call it social investment, but I'll come on to say later that predominantly in essence that means loan investment, particularly in Scotland. And we know that trustees can often be quite nervous. Do you think there were any kind of questions that as a board you asked at Spartans initially, and how did you get round those? Or do you think you had that kind of more slightly commercial board that I guess understood and calculated the risks a bit better? Or
yeah, those who are active in the board, you know, were people who are used to taking probably in fact far bigger financial decisions. You know, these ones are therefore, and these were the core people who were doing the bulk of the work around the boards. And obviously it's a bit chicken and egg. Obviously you pick people on the board who are capable, you know, have the experience of doing these things, and therefore when you're presenting something that for our organisation is big and bold and potentially quite scary, for their thinking, no, well, that's, you know, I've done that through my career for a number of years now, and when I see the evidence in front of me about the ability to repay and the ability to sustain, I'm comfortable. And then those who are not from that background, because it might be education or social care or whatever, you know, there's enough people around the table who were able to persuade the others that there were risks. I mean, we had forecasts for our first, you know, remember 5 years that showed us running out of money in 6 months, and yet we're taking on 10-year loans. But you know, so it was always, to begin with, hand to mouth to a certain extent. But you know, it was thought through and planned. So yeah, so again, I would just emphasise to everybody, you know, do get that breadth of skills on your board that are relevant for what you're trying to do if you can.
Yeah, I know I'll come on to look at kind of that investment readiness stuff, but I think, you know, for me, one of the key differences between being used to going down the applying for funding route and the looking for investment is that sense of how you look at finance differently within your organisation. So a funder will, yes, they'll want a project budget, but in essence, they're always looking back at your accounts and looking back at your history to see how you've managed finance. Whereas as an investor, you're always looking at the future projections. So for a lot of organisations, that real shift to do some of that future financial planning can really require a different skill set that I think is helpful to really understand.
Yeah, I mean, we're dead lucky. We've had 3 individuals now, Nigel, Joe, and we've got a guy called James, who are all very good at producing forecasts, which took into account the fact that Dougie and I are probably slightly more optimistic than the average man on the street and tailor it back to something that's a bit more achievable. So, yeah, so they can persuade the rest of the board that they've already taken the optimism factor of myself and Dougie off the plans.
I'm conscious there's a lot towards Craig in terms of learning, but I don't want to not bring James in terms of some questions as well. And I'm just, in terms of, obviously, I showed the social enterprise eco support kind of system earlier, and there's lots of free support out there. What is it, if you were looking to encourage groups to really try and get broader support out there, what are the kind of places you would pinpoint people towards, James, in terms of the sport experience? Is it some of those, like the generic social enterprise support agencies, or the specific programs they could go to, and how could they find out some good case studies for learning?
Yep. I mean, I guess from a social enterprise perspective, I would encourage them to make contact with Judith at Senscott. We've, as I said to you, it's a bit of a journey for us, this, and there's a lot of learning in it. You know, we've got partnership agreements in place this year with Sam H, with Scottish Sport Futures, and with Senscott. We've been working with Senscott for a number of years, but that's where I would encourage someone to go in the first instance. You know, you can, if you become part of the sport enterprise network, then you'll be able to pick up information, and you'll meet like-minded souls that'll comfort you, or you know, agree with you on some of your ideas that, as Craig's mentioned, might stick out a wee bit if you were going into a sports council meeting and talking about them. So that's where I would encourage people to go. As I say, we have a partnership in place for them, and they have staff on the ground that can help organisations that want to explore some of this thinking. And you know, Craig's point about just chapping doors. You know, the one thing I like about the sporting system is we all are in the main up for helping each other. Although you know, sport's a competitive thing generally. People are willing to share their experiences, their ideas, and you know, it's great to hear that, you know, sailing and football have had a conversation that has benefited both of them. Because from our perspective, that's what a strong system is, where you understand that you've got a responsibility to help others. So that would be my kind of suggestion around the social enterprise piece.
No, thank you. That's helpful. And I know Just Enterprise run a lot of sessions as well, particularly around particular aspects of financial planning that can always be useful, and it's free. So, you know, I'd encourage people to ask. And again, as much as the point about connections, you don't know whether you're going to need that stuff now, but actually if you've learned it and you're ready, you know, don't wait until you're looking for investment to become investment ready. Actually, it's part of a broader health check, because you never know when you're going to suddenly go down those kind of paths, or when funders ask questions. So I think the more you're prepared for what might happen, the quicker you're then able to act and react to situations. I'm conscious that we've got, I know you're off to another meeting as well, James. So I'm just thinking in terms of some of the questions, if people have got others they want to kind of put through on the chat, put them through in the next few minutes. One person was just asking, in terms of some of the funders that Spartans had used, are they still around? And is there any advice in terms of, you know, how do you get that understanding of who is out there to fund kind of sports initiatives?
Yeah, it was Tony from Ducky. Tony, so you can get in touch after this, and we're happy to run through everything we use. But you know, things like the fundingscotland.com website is one which has got a whole massive list of funders. Now, what we find is if we apply cold to a funder, our chances of success are very limited. What you have to do is build a relationship with these funders over time, and some are difficult because, you know, they get inundated, and you know, they don't want to hear speculative stories. But you have to invest time and effort building these relationships with all the variety of funders, because in that Funding Scotland website, I think there must be well over 100 different names of bodies, and some are offering hundreds of pounds and some are offering tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds. So there's such a range in there, but it's about relationship building. And you know, it's interesting. One of the people, the funders who helped us with the food operation around COVID, we had a meeting with this guy in London. I think it was September, October, and they had gone very, very quiet. And we had spent a bit of time with them before then, emailing back and forth before we saw them face to face in London. You know, and again, it had gone quiet after October, and we'd almost written that one off. And then out of the blue, we got, you know, a good chunk of money. Not just this year, a commitment to pay us over 3 years to run some programs that we thought was gone. So you never know when somebody might come back to you. So it pays off just to, you know, have your rolling contact list. I think you mentioned earlier, Naomi, about networking. It's a networking game, yeah. And so, you know, you just keep talking. Interesting, we've never ever had money from sport relief or comic relief. And you thought what we did, particularly sport relief, was ideally. Now we've maybe only applied maybe 3 or 4 times, but we've never been successful for that one. So, and it's maybe because, you know, we haven't spent enough time getting close to them. So, you know, so we're not always successful either.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Certainly, you know, I know from the investment perspective, the investor is obviously looking for the return financially and the social return, but it is very much about what's in your business plan and how do we help you achieve what you're doing. And I think, you know, to some degree, I know if you do go down that route then, and you know you've got that earned income potential and you meet the investment readiness criteria, you meet the social impact criteria, you're not being judged against lots of other organisations. It's very much you're judged on your business plan merit. And I think that's one of the key differences. It's just helpful for organisations to kind of understand that actually it isn't a competition when it comes to investment, because the money's ultimately returned. I was going to finish the session by asking you for a couple of top tips for groups looking at broadening their finance mix moving forwards. But I just wanted to ask one more quick question to Graham. I keep saying Graham because I'm really sorry, Craig. I was just coming back to kind of the partnership approach, and obviously you said you had money from Big Issue Invest as well, and there's very much, when we talk about investment, that it's kind of the money's obviously important, but it's the stuff that sits around the money in terms of the partnership. And I just wondered if you could just perhaps touch on the partnership approach in terms of the relationship with the social investor rather than just the financial aspect.
Well, I think it works 2 ways. One is they help, apart from giving you the money, they obviously help you because you then get to be part of their network. So whether it's the Social Investment Scotland network or the Big Issue Invest network, and it gives you more of an opportunity to learn. So it's been very much a partnership. You know, we will send our, you know, quarterly reports through every quarter. It gives a chance therefore for a dialogue. We'll learn something from that dialogue. The funder will also understand what we've got coming up next. Is it something they're interested in? Is it something we would come back to them on? So that if we were to go back with another request for funding 2 or 3 years later, that it's been warmed up. They know what it's coming. They know what to deliver. They can also, I guess, subconsciously track: are we delivering what we said we're going to deliver over the last 2 or 3 years? Because that's obviously a good guide to the future. So no, I mean, certainly, you know, we've had a cracking relationship with, as I say, both Social Investment Scotland, Big Issue Invest. We just last year paid off, it was 10 years up, we'd paid off that Big Issue Invest final element of the loan, and you know, it was a great journey. And you know, I'm sure at some point in the future we'll be back to them and they'll have remembered who we are. So.
Yeah, thank you. And then just to perhaps finish on what would be your kind of top tip for organisations as they perhaps look to either broaden out their finance or prepare to kind of look at their own vision and path moving forwards?
It's difficult to narrow it down to one, but it's about, and I'm therefore going to combine some of the things in my second slide. It's about clarity on what you're going to achieve. Have that ambition, but have it a robust basis for it in terms of, you know, the business plan. So you can go out, you've a great story to tell because you've got the emotional bit about making a difference, and then you've got the quantifiable bit about, and this is how financially it stacks up. So it's about, once you've got that story to tell, the elevator pitch, I think that James mentioned earlier, once you've got that story to tell, and it's a mixture of, you'll capture somebody emotionally because you've got a great story, and you'll capture their finance people because the numbers stack up as well. And once you have a story to tell, it becomes a lot easier to sell it.
Yeah, thank you. And James, any top tips?
I would probably just, I guess, follow on from what Craig said by just talking about leadership. You know, what I see when I connect with Spartans is leadership, and leadership at multiple levels. And I've probably found a little bit more out today about their wider board and the skills that they have there that I didn't know. So, you know, that for me is what the investment's in ultimately, because it's those leaders that create the ideas and create the plans, and then bring them to life. So, you know, for the organisations in the call, you know, I would encourage them to think about, you know, that leadership piece, who they have around them, to both help them and challenge them. And, you know, I know from, you know, conversations with Dougie that Craig and Dougie's conversations aren't necessarily always, you know, the same and agreed on. I think that's a, you know, an encouraging thing, is that, you know, they are able to, you know, see things from different perspectives because it will help them get the right answer. So, you know, I would final thing I would say is for the organisations, just really to think about that leadership mix that they've got. And if you're a lone wolf with some aspirations in there, then you really need to think about who you can put around you with skills that can really help you realise those ambitions.
No, thank you, James. That's, I think, a great point on which to finish this kind of session with our guest speakers on. So thank you so much, Craig and James, for joining us on that bit. I'm going to kind of go on and do my slides much more about the social investment framework now, and help people understand other players in that. So thank you for joining us, and I know you need to head off for your next meeting. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invite. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to run us through a few more general slides now around social investment. It is a little slide heavy, but that's because there's bits of information. But you'll see as I go through that there's a lot in there in terms of video links. So I try not to touch too much on lots of the detail in this, just to give you a broad overview and perspective. Let me just get the slides up properly. Here we go. We're getting there. There we go. So, I mean, I've already touched on, I guess, the fact that social investment often simply refers to loans, but I thought it was helpful to just give you a bit of that broader sense. So Craig touched on Resilient Scotland, who are able to do a blended finance approach, and I know that's something CIS have done in the past. So that tends to be where there's a real mix of loans and grants coming together. And I would just say, you know, again, when looking at it from that blended finance perspective, we're very much having grant funding in there can give some of that assurance as well that other people have bought into the initiative and the project or the business that you're trying to develop. So the blended approach is something that we certainly encourage, whether it's just through one partner or whether that's through a number of different partners. Toby's going to touch on community shares, so I won't talk too much about that. And I'm not going to touch too much on these other aspects. I have got a slide in at the end that looks at social investment tax relief. It is an initiative that's due to end in April 2020. So if it's something that you're interested in, it's about how individual investors can get tax relief back. And there's lots of different regulations around it, so it's worth understanding those before going down that route. So when you get the slide pack, you'll get links into that And then other bits around social investment that often get linked in, kind of look at things like social impact bonds. In essence, I guess, often thought of as, I guess, payment by results and performance, and equity. But equity obviously requires legal structures that enable that to happen. So it can often, it's not impossible in the social enterprise sector, but it would require you having the right setup. And so we concentrate mostly on the loans today. So social investment, obviously, I try to give this chart up as a sense of where does it fit for organisations. So it's often very difficult describing the kind of non-profit, social enterprise, community kind of approach here. We tend to, I guess, get people thinking the focus is obviously because loan investment requires repayment, you very much have to be operating in that earning side of this spectrum. So that could be earning because you've got service level agreements and contracts. It could be that you're operating, perhaps I think of limited markets, maybe B2B, business to business markets, or in the open market in terms of wider customers and consumers can come in. But the key thing is that in order to be able to take on social investment, you obviously need to be earning income, because you'll need to be making surplus and profits on that, such that you are then able to do repayments. So you have to very much be at that end of the spectrum. Loans get used for all kinds of things in the social enterprise sector, but I guess the three kind of key areas, one might be buying an asset, so having that kind of base from which people operate in, buying buildings, I guess, working capital. So again, if you've got initiatives that you're trying to get going that you know will produce income in the future that would enable you to pay back loans, but you need access to cash now to facilitate that. And then bridging grants, which tends to refer to those organisations that perhaps have funding coming in from, I guess the big example is always European funding, but it's all paid in arrears, and so you need access to cash in the short term. But in essence, it's used to help organisations invest in themselves, to grow and scale what they do, or to diversify what they do. There's a number of social investment providers, and I think, yes, we're running these sessions through CIS, but you know, I would always encourage people to look at who's the best provider for you and how do you go out and do that. So in this slide, I give you a bit of a sense of high street banks will also provide social investment. They will lend money to you as a social organisation, but they will tend to traditionally still look for security. They'll want strong proven models, and it often tends to be for larger amounts of money. And social investment really came in a number of years ago because people were approaching larger banks for loan finance and often found that the answer was no. So social investment came about so that it could actually lend money on an unsecured basis. And it's got a new model up there, but I think it's about, yes, we still need some level of track record to understand those future cash flow projections, but it would fund something at an earlier stage than perhaps the longer track and proven model that a traditional lender might be looking for. And again, you know, in the social investment side, certainly CIS have done loans from the £10,000 upwards, so it can be for smaller amounts of money. And I've put the links on this slide that will get sent out in terms of going onto the Good Finance website for looking at other providers and other bits of information. And then we've got a short little video clip that CIS have put together about why do we need non-mainstream bank providers and what role do they fill. So it just gives you a bit more of that context if you want to dig a bit deeper into that. And then I guess the last thing just to say on these slides as well is it's not that these things operate in isolation. It's very much, I think, if you remember back to Craig's talk, he talked about having a number of different investors. So, you know, that could be that you've managed to get a significant loan from the high street bank based on security, but you're still a certain element short, and then the social investor may come in for that smaller part that can then be offered unsecured. And again, you know, we've had various partnerships in the past that we've done with other providers, or other funders will go in. So certainly don't think of this as a one or the other. I just wanted to pick up a little bit about terms, and I think I said, as Craig was talking about interest rates, that we've got another video clip that I've just hooked into here around how we calculate interest rates. the social investors generally all will do fixed rate. Organisations tend to be able to work with those a lot better than looking down a variable rate approach. We've got loans starting from the £10,000 and CIS have certainly lent up at that higher level as well, beyond the 1.5 million. So we can do larger investments too. And we talk about short and long term. So short tends to be that kind of up to 2 year kind of period. It will perhaps refer mostly to the bridging loan aspect, and the longer term loans are obviously over a more significant period. Generally, I guess the max would be up to the kind of 25-year mark. So much more over a longer period, but that would again be, if you look at kind of loan books, you would find more the outer edges of the £10,000 and the 1.6 and the 25 years, more will fall in a kind of middle ground. I pick up a little bit about the secured and unsecured. So I've said that social investors lend unsecured. You may still get asked if there was security. And again, that's just part of, if there was, it can have an impact in terms of interest rates. So it's worth looking at. But the key thing I always say to note is that a lot of the barriers to social investment tend to come about because trustees are nervous in terms of, is their house on the line? Is there personal liability? The answer's no. But I always say, but you still have to ensure that your board are fully aware of kind of company law, company's house legislation around issues around negligence and running an organisation. So while there's no personal liability from a CIS perspective, always make sure that your trustees are kind of aware of their much broader legal obligations. Then I talk a little bit about debt and patient terms. So again, patient is what it says. So you can borrow the money and you obviously have a period of time before you start paying that back. But I think the key point, and I keep coming back to this, is it's very much relationship based. This is very much about us getting to know customers and supporting them beyond just the financial aspects. So, you know, when we look at choosing an investment partner, I always say to people, absolutely, the cost of finance is important. You're going to look at rates. But I always say, look beyond just the cost of the finance. You know, what is it that you're getting out of the relationship that's beyond the money? And I always get people to think about the volatility in the different businesses. So, you know, as a social investor, organisations want you to achieve your social impact. We know that business plans can be susceptible to change, and it's very much about working with you. So because we're focused as well on more than just the financial return, we'll be working with you to adapt loan plans as you go forward if your business needs a change in them, and to really work with you. And any social investor would say the same. There's, I guess, a sense of flex there that's really important to know. And I guess I always end on this one of choice. You know, will someone actually lend to you? So, you know, to some degree you're limited by who will lend. And I think certainly if you go back to the slide about why did social investment actually start to come about, it's because in the early days of looking at investment in our sector, lots of mainstream financiers were less keen to lend into the social enterprise kind of arena. We've touched a little bit as we've been talking. I guess I tried to pick up some of the points about how has the landscape changed. Are we moving from a situation where perhaps where in the past there was a sense of like, well, we've had funding for the last 10 years. How is that changing? There are more organisations out there. What pressures does that put on your current relationships? How has your business changed? I mean, that's a tough one just now, I think, in terms of understanding your own financial projections. And I always say, you know, this is very much about looking at this from a finance mix perspective, a blended model. Don't see this as a kind of, no, we're absolutely all about grants or we're all about investment. Chances are it's somewhere a mix of the two. And I think I always, again, say to groups, you know, we're not in the business of lending money to people that can't afford it. So we very much, you know, social investment wouldn't be right for every organisation. I think investment readiness is right for all organisations. I think regardless of where you're getting your funding from, having that strong organisation and that strong thinking, that strong approach to how you manage yourself is critical regardless of your source of finance. So I'd encourage you to still think about that. Craig touched a little bit around ownership and control. I think we talked a little bit, and again, when you get the slide pack sent out to you, we've got a lot more kind of points that have come up in our previous sessions about kind of advantages and disadvantages of grant finance or social investment finance. These are unique to organisations. Comes back to the point James was making about the uniqueness. This is very different. You can learn from other organisations, but only you will know where your kind of real sense of whether you want to be kind of chasing funding and finance and fitting with plans, or whether you want to kind of have that sense of being slightly more commercial, whether you're right to do that. And I guess I put on that thing about risk appetite and what risks are you managing. So we often talk about risk in relation to loan finance. It's the traditional language, I guess. But, you know, what are the risks if you're not going down that kind of route? Are you risking jumping from funding to one funding source to another, of projects starting and finishing? And, you know, they're different. So you might be managing financial risk on one side, but you might be managing social risk on another. And I think it's a really complicated arena in the social sector. I wanted also to just touch on partners and perception. I think sometimes who you partner with can also create a different impression. And I think Toby touches a little bit on this when we think of community shares. So again, when we look at the community shares model, we see that community buying can have a positive effect then in terms of funders who can see that the community is behind a project. And I think, you know, again, who you're seen to be with can really influence, again, you know, the consequence of perhaps going down a loan finance route and having been successful in repayments and relationships and having managed funds. Does that give people then a real sense that you are a strong organisation when it comes to financial management? And just so understand kind of partnership in terms of that wider impression. And then I've just put those last couple of points about fit to business plan and focus. I think many of you that are kind of very familiar with the grant environment, you know, do we end up changing the focus of our projects and organisations as we jump from one fund to another? Or are we really fixed on our business plan, and how in a different kind of finance and blended approach does that change? So again, it will be unique to your organisation how that is. But I think it's always worth thinking whether you're kind of almost being funding led or whether you're business plan led. And then the last one I just picked up on is around reporting and systems. So we know everyone complains about kind of writing different reports to different funders. It's part of the game, I guess. It's part of what we have to do. And I guess it's just, if you're obviously going down the loan finance route, you probably would expect someone more regular to be asking how you're doing from a financial perspective, as well as just the social. So it's not that there's no reporting within the finance system. I think it's an expectation that if you're investment ready to go down the loan finance route, you will have robust systems that mean actually producing financial reports is something you do ordinarily. It shouldn't be an additional burden. It should be something that you're doing currently with your board. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense around the kind of things you might want to consider, and talk through with your senior team, with the board of directors, your trustees, about how they understand the kind of what are the different risks you're taking and how might a blended approach fit. And then I wanted to just touch, before we hand on to Toby, who's looking at community shares, around what do we mean by investment readiness? And I think it was something that we were always asked about in terms of people coming in for loan finance. What do we mean? We talk about investment ready. So SIS took time to develop a diagnostic tool that's available on our website, and the link to that's on the next slide. And we identified there being 6 key areas that we looked at in terms of being investment ready. So they're listed here: social impact, governance, the products and service, the people skills within your organisation, the business plan, and the financial controls. And I think you'll have heard Craig certainly touch on numbers of these around We've talked quite a bit, I guess, about the social impact and the governance side. But again, he talked quite a lot about having that very clear vision, which comes from that business planning side. He talked about having kind of the link between the club and the charitable arm. And I think that's all that sense of kind of perhaps not as crude as maybe sales and marketing, but it is all about that's kind of where your potential market is and where your connections might be. So just thinking it through in terms of how that fits your organisation. And then looking at that people skills side, do you have all the right people involved in terms of financial acumen, social impact measurement, partnerships and connections? So what is it? And I think, again, from an investment perspective, we also look at, is there too much onus perhaps on one person? So it's, and that to us would potentially be seen as quite high risk. So actually we look very much at it being a team, so that if one person left, the organisation's not left flummoxed, I guess, in terms of moving on. So very much looking at people skills from a team perspective. And there's the link to the investment readiness tool. It's worth going through regardless, I think, of whether you're looking at investment or whether you're simply looking at funding. It gives you a really good sense of a health check. It's a series of questions that you go through and you can get kind of the results, but the questions will give you a sense of some of the things that it's worth really looking at and considering. And maybe that's a tool you can use with your senior management team or your trustees to kind of understand where your organisation's currently at. And then the last bits from me are just looking at the application process. So again, perhaps one of the things that's quite different around the social investment route versus the more traditional grant funding is we don't have an application form. It all starts with a conversation, whether that's a phone call or an email, and it's very much about developing a proposal alongside you. So we don't anticipate that by the time you come to us, you'll know all of the answers. You may not even know all of the questions. We're very much about leading you on that journey and working with someone. And then once you've got that proposal developed, it's considered by an investment committee. And I think then the thing that's important to note is at that point, obviously for us, it's not just that you either get it or you don't. It could be that it's approved, it could be it's declined, or we could go back and say, well, actually, this bit needs more work, and these were where the concerns and questions were. So I've put a couple of video links just on this slide again. One just obviously talks about that kind of picking up the phone and making that application, but the other is just, it's a slightly longer video, just on looking at kind of how do you prepare a business plan for a loan application. It's a question we're asked all the time. And I guess as you hear the team talking about that, I think it's also worth thinking that the reason there's not one clear answer on this is you can imagine if you go back to the slide where I was saying, we've funded people from the £10,000 mark to the 1.6 million, is we would anticipate very different levels of information and very different levels of detail, regardless of what it was you're asking for. So it's worth just looking on those videos if you want to get a little bit more guidance. So that was all I was going to talk about in terms of my slides, and I'm going to stop sharing. And then I don't know if there's any just little bits of questions that have just come in as we've gone through that. If there is, feel free to just keep popping stuff in the chat and we'll come to it. What we were going to do with the last part of our session today is hand over to Toby from Community Share Scotland. He'll tell you more about them, so I don't need to. But just looking at the Community Shares approach, what it is, what it means, and how it may also be part of a blended finance mix. So over to you, Toby, and you're saved of my voice for a wee while now.
Thank you very much, Naomi. And great to hear the speakers earlier as well. It's a really good couple of case studies, I think. So I'm just going to give a very quick introduction to community shares, looking at what community shares are, thinking about how you might use them and how some other communities have used them, and then looking at a case study of a group that we've worked with in the sort of sports sector. So community shares, at their most basic, community shares are a way to raise money, and I think that they're most closely linked to crowdfunding. So you as an organisation would be asking the people who support you and support what you do to invest their own money in what you're doing, and ultimately lots of people putting in certain amount of money each becomes a big pool of money that you can hopefully do something significant with. Those people who buy shares then become members of the organisation, and they're allowed some influence over the organisation and how it's run. So they get to vote towards the management committee, they get to exert some influence that way. And they can also see some financial return from their investment. So the idea with this is that if everything goes to plan and the business plan is successful, those people will then get their money back, and they might also get interest on their share. So community shares are really quite a flexible form of finance. Can really be used to fund anything that you can make a business case for and convince a community of people to invest in. In Scotland, we've seen lots of shops recently, lots of community-owned shops, starting to see more community-owned pubs, which are really common in England and Wales as well. All sorts of community buildings, lots of renewable energy schemes. In terms of sports, I'll show you a Scottish example later. We've also got various sports clubs across the UK. I think most notably there's FC United of Manchester who use community shares when they sort of set up their offshoot to Manchester United. So some of the key facts about community shares: to be able to issue community shares, you have to be a specific legal form, either a community benefit society or a cooperative society. In both those cases, both types of society are member-owned, so the shareholders are all members, and they tend to operate on a principle of one member, one vote. So each shareholder holds one vote towards the management committee, regardless of how many shares they own. Whether you had £100 or £10,000, both those people have an equal voice, and the organisation aims to be really democratic and to allow those people to use their voice to say how they think things should be run. One of the key distinctions between community shares and shares in private companies, as you might be more familiar with them, is that community shares are termed as withdrawable shares. What that means is that they can't move between two different people. You couldn't buy a share and then go off and sell it for a profit. You can only withdraw it from the organisation. So you would go back to the society that you bought the share from, and you would get your money back. If you paid £100, you'd get £100 back. It doesn't change in value. So community shares are in their own right a really great way to raise money. We've worked with groups who've raised into hundreds of thousands, even in some cases millions of pounds. It can raise really big sums, but also it's a really great way to attract further funding. So a lot of groups that we work with use community shares as part of a much bigger funding mix. Quite often they might be taking grant funding, loan finance. In some cases, the community shares element is quite a small chunk. It might be as low as 5 or 10% of the overall money they need. But it's really good for showing grant providers and other finance providers that people support what you're doing and really want to see it happen. So I mentioned there about community benefit societies. These are a specific legal structure. So it's set up as a corporate body. It can employ staff, it can own assets, much like a company would. The difference with these is that rather than being registered with Companies House, they're registered with the Financial Conduct Authority. So if you wanted to set up a community benefit society, you would apply to the Financial Conduct Authority. You would put together a set of rules, which would be much like the sort of articles of association of a company. What tends to happen is that you would access model rules from an appropriate body. So these would be rules that have already been sort of pre-approved by the FCA, and you just insert your information into them, essentially like a template, and then you can send it off it, and that reduces the cost and time it takes to register things. There is a small fee involved in registering a society, probably total cost of up to £400 or £500. And the time taken, it takes a little bit longer than setting up a company, but the FCA's time to approve things, they aim for within 15 working days. So we're speaking about maybe a matter of weeks to months to have it registered, but not too long. Community benefit societies can be registered as a charity. So if it's important to you that you have charitable status, OSCR do now approve community benefit societies as charities, and we have quite a few examples of that working in practice now. They're also a really well respected form of community governance, so they're eligible for community right to buy, for community asset transfer, really anything that you can do with a company or with a SKIO you can do with a community benefit society. There are also options if you're an existing organisation, say you're already set up as a company or you're already set up as a SKIO. There's kind of a couple options for you if you did want to go down the path of creating a community benefit society. You could either completely convert the existing organisation, and in the case of a company, that's really quite straightforward. With a SKIO, it's a little bit more complicated, but it still can be done. Or there are options to sort of link the two organisations. So you could have formal relationship between the two. You can't have a situation where the existing organisation has complete control over the society, because the society still has to have its member ownership. But you could have agreements about profit sharing. You can have agreements about directors being shared between the two boards and things like that to ensure that there's a formal link between the two. So I've got a case study here from Govanhill in Glasgow. This was a share offer that took place in 2017, and they raised almost £300,000, £267,000 they raised, from I think around 550 investors, and that money included £100,000 match funding from a organisation called Big Society Capital, which is a UK government social investment arm. So around 167,000 from sort of individual shareholders. And they were set up using model rules that were put together by Co-ops UK. Co-ops UK are the UK-wide body to support cooperatives and also do a lot around community benefit societies. So they put forward, they have fairly standard model rules that quite a lot of societies use and tend to be appropriate for a lot of things. So work's now underway at Govanhill Bath to restore the historic, I think, Georgian era bathhouses. They had hoped that they would reopen earlier this year, but obviously with everything that's gone on, that's been delayed a little bit. But work's pretty well on their way to refurbish them as a state-of-the-art sports facility. And they'll be doing lots of community work. They have lots of work around making sure that the facilities are fully accessible to everybody. So as well as that, community shares money, they also received grant funding from various funders, like the National Lottery Heritage Fund, Scottish Government, Glasgow City Council, I think the Robertson Trust as well. And in total, the total cost of this project was, I think, around £6 million for the full renovation. So like I said earlier, this is an example of one where community shares was quite a substantial sum of money, but in proportion, it's probably around 5-10% of what they needed overall. But in a lot of those cases, a lot of that grant funding was conditional on them raising community shares. I know certainly the National Lottery money was awarded on the condition that they would raise a certain amount in community shares. So this community share campaign became a really important part of their funding mix. So Community Share Scotland, the organisation I work for, we were set up in 2014, which is when the sort of current legislation around community benefit societies came into power. We were funded by the National Lottery and by the Scottish Government, so everything that we provide is free to access. And we're delivered in partnership with the Development Trust Association, who are a network of community organisations across Scotland, so we work quite closely with them. And the main strands of what we do are really raising awareness and understanding about community shares. So we do lots of events like this, helping people to work out what it's all about and whether it's right for them. And then we can offer hands-on support and guidance to groups who want to do this. I'm missing a slide there. Sorry, there should be another slide there about the support we offer, but I'll just have to summarise it. So we're a team based in Edinburgh, but covering the whole of Scotland. So myself and my colleague Morven would work with you to establish if community shares are a good option for you, if you want to learn more, help you work out if it makes sense for you to go down this route further. If we both decide that community shares are a good option for you, we can then bring in funded business consultancy. So we could assign you with an experienced community shares practitioner for up to 6 days to help you develop a share offer and help you look at things like getting your business plan in place, thinking about your community engagement strategy, looking at all your governance and helping you to register your society. We can help with all of that. We also offer a grant of up to £5,000 to help to promote share offers. So typically in the past that's been used for things like graphic design costs, printing costs, anything that's going to help you have your campaign seen by as many people as it can be. Also, just to say, we've just launched a brand new website just last week, so please go check this out at communitysharescotland.org.uk, and it's got a sort of interactive tool that you can scroll through and hopefully will help you to sort of address any initial questions you have, and then you can get in touch with us to speak about anything more specific than that, but it will hopefully help with the introductory stuff. So that is really the end of my quick fly through, and I'm happy now to take any questions people have.
Thank you, Toby. It's great. I think the really nice thing about running these sessions kind of with a theme, and obviously we've got our sport and leisure one today, is we can actually pull out case studies that are really relevant as well. So I think it was good to hear about Govanhill in that. I've got a couple of questions, if that's all right, just to pick up on. And I think it came up a little bit on our session last week about kind of perhaps it's whether it's community shares or a more broader crowdfunding approach, that link to kind of by getting people to almost put money in at an early stage. How much do you think people that kind of put in a Govanhill in terms of investors, how many of them are likely to then go in and use that? How do you think it helped them with their business plan moving forwards?
I think it is a really important part of a lot of these community businesses, and I think definitely when you see it with things like the community shops that we're working with that tend to be quite local, small communities, I think people who have bought into that, have put £100-200 into helping launch a community shop, will then shop in the shop and they will want to support it and they'll want to make sure it's a success. So I do think that, as well as the sort of financial aspect of community shares, there's a really strong element of building the community and building the supporter base of people who are then, literally invested in what you're doing and want it to be successful.
Thank you. I think it's just helpful to kind of understand that. I think it's probably a related question that's just around, obviously a lot of people when they set up kind of crowdfunding, whether it's the community shares model or the broader crowdfunding approach, often set up rewards in the early days. How do you think they, again, help, and what advice would you give to people if they were looking at that kind of almost using a reward-based structure for getting people to invest?
Yeah, so I suppose it's worth noting that there's really 4 different types of crowdfunding that we would speak about. So firstly, you've got sort of donations crowdfunding, which tends to be for charities. It tends to be people putting in fairly small sums of money individually, maybe in the sort of tens up to small hundreds of pounds individually. And all they're really doing that for is to support a good cause. They don't get anything in return. You then have rewards crowdfunding, where people might get something back in return. Sometimes it's things like t-shirts, badges. Sometimes it's sort of pre-ordering the product that a company is trying to launch. In those cases, you start to get into slightly bigger sums of money from individuals. And then you've got debt crowdfunding, which is sometimes called peer-to-peer lending, and equity crowdfunding, which are really the more sort of serious investment level of crowdfunding, where people start putting in really big sums of money, and it tends to be more regulated. So I think the reward stuff can be really good for a lot of companies, and I think you can attract a lot of people with that. But I guess you have to weigh up how much people might be willing to invest for not getting any financial return.
Thank you. And then I just wanted to pick up, it's perhaps a broader one that's, I guess, very specific to the kind of community shares model and the BenCom kind of approach. What are the kind of, obviously once you've obviously given people the share and they've got that say in your organisation, have you got any experiences or top tips about how people have managed that kind of governance aspect moving forwards?
I think in practice, what you're required to do is to hold an AGM each year, and all the members are entitled to come along to the AGM. They're entitled to stand to be on the management committee, and they can obviously vote for anyone who does stand. In practice, most societies, that's where the member involvement kind of begins and ends. And you know, I think it's good practice to communicate with people regularly and keep everybody up to date. But it's not like the members are voting on day-to-day activities. I think it's a bit more arm's length than that. But we've got some really good examples of communities that do good engagement work, you know, where they have regular newsletters, and they maybe have other meetings outside of the AGM as sort of strategy meetings or ideas meetings where people can come along and suggest changes. I think especially for things like community shops or community businesses where people might have strong views about, you know, what should be happening, that can be quite productive as well.
Yeah, I think it almost feels like we've come full circle in terms of, we started our session today talking about actually how you need to look. I think it was James from Sports Scotland talking about looking beyond the sport and that broader community involvement. So it almost feels like that's where we started our conversation today, and we're coming back to that sense of community buy-in and really understanding what your local community wants. That's critical, I guess, to your model, but also as Sports Scotland are saying, is becoming more and more critical to sports organisations generally too.
Yeah, I mean, we're really keen to work with more sports organisations because it feels like a really good fit for sports facilities. You know, they've already got a sort of members base. They tend to have, you know, regular users and people who probably are willing to put money in to support facilities being built and sports clubs being launched. So we're definitely happy to speak about any ideas people have.
Thank you, Toby. Unless any further questions come through, and I'll give people just a couple of minutes, and then I just thought I'd just finish with just the last bits about some slides and just some other last bits so that you've got a sense of when the slides come out to you what you'll see, and just unless there's any last questions. No, I'll just share through those and then we'll all be good. So it's just to give you a sense of what to expect when we share the slides out. Here we go. Resume. So when the slides come out, you'll see we've put lots of extra links in terms of other people, Resilient Scotland, I think Craig talked of, obviously our own website, community shares, but I'd really highlight the Good Finance one here. Has got a wealth of information on it. The Just Enterprise we talked about in terms of the broader business support that you might be able to access as well. And if you're at an earlier stage in terms of setting up your organisation, we have the First Port link on there. So they're all in, so that hopefully that's useful for you when the slides come out. I mentioned early on in the session today about social investment tax relief. So again, I've put the links there to the Big Society Capital website, where they've got some really good videos about SITR, as it's commonly abbreviated to, yet another of the acronyms. So that's coming through to you as well. Obviously, we've got our own contact details. And then I've just put a few extras together here. I think I touched on them about, you know, what are the benefits around social investment that might be worth just going through, but equally, what are the challenges? We believe it's really important to give everyone a balanced view and also a sense of who all the other providers are, hence the links to people like Good Finance and talking about Big Issue Invest and Resilient Scotland. So it's really important that people have that. And again, I've just touched here on, because we know one of the big challenges is always the personal liability issue. It's that video I mentioned here. And then the last few slides I've got are all just looking at some of those questions I referred to around investment readiness. So we've got slides, as you can see on these last few here, just around those 6 key themes. And it just gives you a sense of what some of those questions are. There's obviously much more detail in the diagnostic, and I would encourage you to take a look, even just to do it as part of a health check really in your organisation. And I guess I'll just finish today by saying, if you have got any questions, do contact Sis, contact Toby. We're here to help, and when we send out the slideshow, I'm sure if there's any questions that come to mind, or if there are any that you didn't want to ask in a kind of public arena, then feel free to come to us. As we always say, it all starts with a conversation. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you very much, Toby.
Perfect. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.